These are my 3-ish questions for healthy biblical application. And this is from the perspective of the teacher, right? So when we're creating application in a message or in a Bible lesson, we should ask ourselves these questions. So, number one, what was the original audience's reading or listening experience? Okay, like when they were reading the text, what would they have been thinking? What would they have been feeling, right? So that the original audience's reading experience, and what was the timeless truth that the original audience would have learned? So those are it's really 2 questions, I guess, but that's the first question that you need to ask yourself. So I'll give you an example using Joseph and Potiphar's wife, that narrative. So Kimberly, I know you said you like specific examples from the text. So we're going to stick with this narrative all night. So like when you're reading that text about Joseph and Potiphar's wife, I mean, first initially what the original readers would have been experiencing is excitement, right? Like he's getting a promotion. This is really exciting. He's doing well in Potiphar's house. They would have thought about, divine justice, right? This is good, right? God said that he's going to basically be a ruler someday, and now he's been mistreated. So this is good. Like God is giving my boy a break. Well, then they would have experienced shock at the temptation. Like, what is this crazy woman doing seducing this man? Like, that's really messed up. And then, but admiration for his integrity. Like, all right, he's doing the right thing. He's fleeing temptation. That's good. Next, they would have experienced dismay, right? He was falsely accused. And now he's in prison in a situation where he shouldn't be. There would have been confusion over the injustice. Why is God allowing such a terrible thing to happen to an innocent man? Again, I mean, this is the second like bad break that this guy has had, right? Confusion over why God is allowing this. Then at the very end of the narrative, he ends up going to prison, but then it says God was with him, and then he still ended up being placed over the entire prison. So he's still kind of in this management position. So then maybe there's a little bit of hope that God still has his hand on this guy. He's still with this guy. And then some suspense. What's going to happen next? Like God's clearly doing something. And we remember this dream that he had where he was going to be a ruler someday, but we don't quite see it yet, but we know God's doing something, right? So those would have been all of the experiences that they would have had while reading that text. So next, we want to look at the timeless truth. Now, here's a tip. In order to find a timeless truth in a text, the primary timeless truth in a text, you want to ask yourself, what does this text teach about God, man, salvation, sin, suffering, or righteous living? So 95% of the time, whatever the text is teaching you about God or mankind or salvation or sin or suffering or righteous living, that's going to help you find the timeless truth. So, for example, the timeless truth in this narrative would be even amid confusing trials and unjust accusations, God is with his people and at work for a greater purpose. So, if we can, let's take just a second here and let's call on our builders here. So, Rachel and Jessica, can y'all help us think through why is this a good question to start with? So these 2 questions of what was the original audience's reading and listening experience, and what timeless truths did the original audience learn? Like, why is that a good place for us as Bible teachers to start when we're trying to develop application for our audience? What's your best guess for the builders in the room?
Because that's what the author was intending for the original audience.
Yeah, that's like where the spirit started. So maybe we should start there too.
Yeah, excellent. That's the exact same reason I had. So the spirit began by intending for an original audience to hear something. The spirit began by intending for the original audience to hear something, to understand something. And if we skip that and we don't ask what was intended by the author for the original audience, then we are going to miss what the Spirit intended for people to experience and what the Spirit intended for people to understand. So yeah, we want to start with the original audience so that we don't miss the Holy Spirit's intention in the text. So excellent job, builders. All right, let's go to our next one. And builders, I'll ask you the same question with this one. We'll pick on the rookies during our next bid. But for now, the question is, so we've already asked, what was the original experience? What was the original timeless truth in the text? The second question we want to ask when we're building application as Bible teachers is, how can I present this text so that my listeners fully experience the effects and naturally arrive at the intended truths, right? So the second thing we want to ask is, how can I teach this text? How can I present this text so that my listeners actually think the things that the original audience would have thought, and they feel the experiences in this text that the original audience would have experienced? And then how do I help them to arrive at those timeless truths that the original audience would have arrived at? So, for example, in the narrative of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, what I would do in order to make sure that my audience experiences the text is I would walk them through the plot of that narrative, right? And I would guide them. I would narrate it for them. Okay, look, he got a promotion. So the original audience would have thought this is God's justice, but now he's being falsely accused. The original audience would have thought that that's terrible. They would have been confused at what God is doing. So you're walking them through the text, you're presenting the text, and you're guiding them to have the right emotional reactions that they should be having. So here's a really good tip. This is useful. Anytime you're teaching a narrative, you want to make sure that your listeners experience the plot. Anytime that you're teaching a poem, like in the Psalms, for example, you want to make sure that your listeners experience the imagery. And anytime that you're teaching prose, like an epistle, you want to make sure that your listeners experience the argument. So the way that we make sure that our listeners are experiencing the text is you use the plot when you're teaching narrative, you use the image when you're teaching poetry, and then you use the arguments when you're teaching prose. So that's how you help them to experience the text. And then a second tip for helping your listeners actually experience the text is to show them from the text those literary tools that create those timeless truths. So, for example, if I were teaching through Joseph and Potiphar's wife, I would show, hey, the text says 3 times, or the text says 4 times, and the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord was with Joseph. Right? So the text says it 4 times. I'm going to say it 4 times so that they experience the fact that God is with Joseph, even in the midst of this trial. Right? So that's the thing that we can do to make sure that our contemporary audience is having the same experience of the original audience, and so that they can have the same conclusion, experience the same timeless truth. So let's go back to our builders again. So Jessica and Rachel, why is this a good second question? When we're building toward application, why is this a good pit stop? Why do we want to make sure, before we start applying things really specifically, why do we want to make sure that our people engage the experience of the text and go ahead and conclude the timeless truths of the text on their own?
I mean, if this is the genre or the form in which the author chose to present these truths, then like there's something unique about the experience of the truths that would lead to a certain type of application. So if we were just to pull something in one genre, like pull a narrative and present it like a poem, then it's not going to replicate the same experience that the poem itself does. Right? Maybe.
That was perfectly said. Jessica, is there anything you could possibly add to that?
No, I think that's just what God was saying and how he chose to say it. So we're kind of facilitating the same experience that honestly, for me, this is just a big weight off the shoulders, because you don't have to create something. This is what is already there, and you are facilitating the same experience that God already did. You're just pulling that out and presenting it to the audience.
Those were beautiful answers. Okay. Yeah, that's varsity stuff, guys. Excellent job. So, just to kind of summarize that, because that was beautifully said. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Let me tell you a mistake that especially beginners, hey rookies, listen up. Okay, this is an easy mistake for beginners to make. Is you figure out, you're like, hey, I got some good study tools. I figured out how to take the Bible and extract truths, and now I'm going to teach these truths. So what you do is you basically you take the poem or you take the story, and then you take out the truth that you learn, and then you teach everybody that truth. But guess what you're not teaching? The text. Like, you got the truth from the text, but now you're not really engaging the text. You're just preaching your points. You're just preaching the text. You're preaching your truth that you got from the text instead of teaching the text. So the way that you make sure that your people are actually engaging the text is by facilitating the experience of the text. And Rachel, you said that so well. Like, God put it in a poem because he wanted you to experience this truth through imagery. He chose poetry for a reason. Like, he didn't just say, hey, here's 3 points about God being a shepherd, right? If he wanted you to learn 3 points about God being a shepherd, he would have given you 3 points about God being a shepherd. He didn't do that. Instead, he painted this picture through poetic imagery about God being a shepherd, right? So whenever we fail to make sure that people are engaging the genre, if it's a narrative, and then we forget to make them engage the plot, or if it's a poem and they don't engage the imagery, and then we just go over here and start preaching truths and points, like, we're failing to have them experience the truth the way that God wanted them to experience it. Right? And Jess said that.
Does that happen to have a name?
I call it preaching your points instead of the text. So, and the points may be from the text, but now it's like you're treating the Bible like a container of truths. And you dig in there and you find your truths, and then you preach your truths instead of preaching the text. And it's so easy to do. Like, absolutely no judgment to people who do this. I will say, when you do this in an epistle, it's usually okay, because a lot of times epistles are just points. But even that, there's argumentation, there's warnings, there's encouragement, there's rebukes, there's lists. Like, the way that the epistles communicate, there's still, argumentation that's being made. So you still even want to say, now the original audience would have been asking this question, so then Paul answers it this way. You still want to paint the drama even of the argumentation, right? We never just want to preach points. We always want to preach the text. So beautifully said, ladies. That was really well said. I couldn't have said that any better myself. We don't just want to say what God says. We want to say what God says, how God says it. And how he says it is in narrative. How he says it is in poetry, right? Beautifully said. Okay, last question to make sure that we're doing application in a healthy way as Bible teachers. We want to ask this. What should all believers think, feel, do, and who should they be in light of the text? Right? What should all believers think, feel, and do, and who should they be in light of this text? And then a follow-up on that is, how can I demand or encourage, and how can I vividly illustrate the ideal response for my listeners? Okay, so let me give you another example. I'll use Joseph and Potiphar's wife again. I want to apply this text holistically. So I want my audience to know what to think, which is usually just the primary timeless truth. But I also want them to know how to feel. Like, the fact that God is with his people in trials should be a great comfort to us, right? This is how we should feel comforted. Hey, the fact that God allows terrible things to happen to innocent people is a struggle for Christians, right? That is a confusing thing for us. Like, we should feel confused at this point in the narrative. It's meant to confuse us. It's meant to make us wrestle with this. So if, as we're going through this narrative, you're wrestling with God's goodness and his sovereignty, like, that's good. It's supposed to make you wrestle. So you're telling them what to think, how to feel, and also what to do. So we want to always teach the text holistically to the whole person. We also want application to be immediate. Like, right now, as I'm teaching this text, you should be comforted by God. Right now, as I'm teaching this text, you should have hope that God has a sovereign plan, like immediate application. Right now, we should think this. Right now, we should feel this. But then you also want application for the long haul. Okay, so this means in 6 months, when you're still struggling with infertility, you should still remember that even through long trials, God has a sovereign plan, right? So, immediate and long-term application. I would also encourage you to use the tone of the text. So if you'll notice, I said, how can I demand/encourage my people, right? So if you're in the prophetic genre, or if you're in like the book of James, you know, like James is like, hey, this is true and pure religion, right? He's being straightforward. Like, you want to take on the tone of the author. If the author is being blunt, you want to be blunt. But if you're in Psalm 23 and the author is being, gentle, you want to be gentle, right? So match the tone of the author. And then lastly, I would say, Renee, I know you're new, but you can look in our library. Our team just worked together to make what we call an application grid. It's a really practical grid. It just has kind of 20 women that you would see in an average Bible study, and 20, pictures of what they would look like. So you can kind of go through that grid and paint a really vivid picture. So for example, let's say, it's true, I actually just read this today, that at any given time in America, 2% of women are being cheated on by their spouse. 2%. So if you're teaching to 100 women, 1 or 2 of them has probably got a spouse who's being unfaithful. So to the woman, if you're in here tonight and your husband is not being faithful, like during this trial, hear the word of the Lord. God is faithful. God is with his people, right? Or let's say hypothetically, a woman was unjustly fired from a job position, right? Like that would be a good time to come in and say, because that happens every once in a while, to say, God has a good plan, even in the worst of injustices. Like God has a good plan. That would be the time to talk to that woman in the back of the room, and making sure you know your people and painting vivid pictures for them. And you can use that grid to do that. So those are the 3 questions. Okay, we have a surprise vote. Real quick, is this laser thingy super obnoxious, helpful, or both? Please type in A, B, or C. We're going to take 10 seconds to do this vote. Super obnoxious, helpful, both. Maybe you also haven't noticed it.
I haven't.
Oh, there we go. Okay, D. I didn't notice it. Wendy, do you mind tallying that up for us?
Sure, you've got 4 Bs, 1 C, and 1 D.
4 Bs, as in
Yep.
boy?
Yep, boy, B as in boy, 4 boys.
Great. Okay, well, we'll keep it up. All right. Surprise vote. There we go. All right, so here are the 3 questions for review. Let's stop real quick. Do we have any questions about these? I know we quizzed our builders. You guys did a fantastic job here. Does anyone have any questions about these questions that we use to create healthy biblical application?
I want to be off base with my question because that's just how my brain works. But I feel like what I'm getting is basically you're still not trying to spoon feed it to your audience. You're not doing the thinking for them. You want them to get there kind of organically, just kind of maybe point them in the right direction, but they're still going to choose, like, am I taking, the left or the right fork, basically.
Yeah. If you'll notice, every time I teach, I say, hey, my name's Erin Piner. I want to thank you so much for the privilege of being your guide as we see what God is going to say through this text. The reason I say that, well, 1, because I always used to get nervous at my introductions and I didn't know what to say at the beginning, so it helps. 2 is because I want to remind everybody that I'm the guide, right? So my job is not to tell you exactly what God is saying. My job is to guide you through his word to help
Okay.
you conclude and see what he's saying. And there's one primary reason for that, and it's this: that if all I ever do is spoon feed my listeners, after a year or 2 or 3, they start closing their Bibles at the beginning of the sermon and they start looking at me instead of the text. And eventually I teach them that they need me to tell them truth. What I want to teach them is that God is going to tell us the truth. I'm just going to be your guide, but this is the safari, right? So I don't want to train women to listen to me because I'm the only one who knows how to read the Bible. I want to train them to read the Bible with me, right?
Mhm.
So I don't mind being better at Bible reading than them, but I never want to replace Bible reading for them. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a
All right.
question, if we have
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, go ahead.
In teaching the text, where would you put all these? Would you do the application towards the end? Would you present it kind of throughout as you're teaching? Where would you present the timeless truth? Where would you encourage them for immediate application? Where would you put it in your teaching?
Mm-hmm. So default, I'll give you my default and then I'll give you a second answer. The default for narrative should always be that the timeless truth and the application goes at the end. The default for poetry should usually be that the timeless truth and application goes at the end. And the reason for that is because usually a narrative, actually, you can't get to the timeless truth until you get to the end. And you can't see the full image and the implication until the end. And you're going to start accidentally chopping it up and moralizing it, which we'll talk about in a little bit. For example, if I just stopped right after Joseph fled temptation, well, obviously I'm going to be like, well, right here, let me make the main point that, you need to flee sexual sin. Now, I think that's a fine secondary application, but to get to the primary application, which is really where I want to focus, we have to go through the whole narrative. We have to. So narratives are built to accumulate. Poetry is usually built to culminate. Epistles and prose, you can usually interrupt because argumentation is easy to interrupt for application. Now, so that's my default. Those would be my answers. Narrative to the end, poetry to the end, epistles, you can alternate. That said, the more comfortable people get with teaching, you're going to get better and better at, in your introduction, going ahead and showing your audience maybe how they are actually in the same seat as the original audience. And then as you drive along the narrative, you can actually alternate and show how the audience is in the same position throughout the narrative. So for example, with the Joseph narrative, I'll give you an example of what that would look like is maybe in my introduction, I would say, we all face injustices, and I would give examples. Some of you were abused, or some of you have been, maybe you've been cheated on, or maybe you've been stolen from. And then what I could do is, as we go through that narrative, during the time where it's shocking that he's being tempted, I could go ahead and bring them in. Maybe you've been tempted and you did the right thing, right? Maybe you were at a job and you were working hard. Maybe you were in a relationship and you were being faithful, right? So then I can start weaving them into the narrative. That's very hard. I would say don't do that until you're very comfortable weaving people into a narrative in a responsible way. Otherwise, it's very easy to moralize. But for advanced teachers, if you've taught over 20 or 30 times, I think it's something fun to dabble with. And eventually, I've seen it done responsibly. It's just hard to do responsibly, but it can be done responsibly. So beginners, don't do that. But if you've been doing this for a year or so, I think it can be really effective. So sorry, that was not a very concise answer, but that's my honest answer. Was that helpful, Sheena?
That was very helpful. Thank you.